Just wanted to welcome everybody today. Today we're going to be hearing from Grant Mourre from SPC Nickel. Grant is the CEO of the company, and they specialize in, um, in nickel copper PGM exploration in North America. Grant's experience has been over 25 years within the industry. So he's going to go ahead and talk about their new developments at the Wes Graham and Muscot projects.
Thanks, Kylie. I've been dodging Kylie and Michaela for months, it seems like. So they finally tracked me down. And thanks for coming out, even though it's game one of the Leafs Lightning. And Leafs fan, you usually only get 4 games. So I'm surprised that you guys are choosing to miss it, but I'll try to get through as quickly as possible so you can get home for the third period. Yeah, today I just kind of keep it simple. I normally have to do these investor presentations that I get really tired of, so it'll be more just some geology and lots of pictures. And if you have some questions, feel free to jump in. So the only it's not really, it's cut off on the one side. I think you have to. Oh, there's nothing important on the sides anyways. It's all in the middle. Yeah, it's still, anyways, that's all right. So the only kind of marketing I'll say is a little bit about SPC Nickel. As Kylie mentioned, we are a nickel-focused exploration company listed on the TSXV just about 2 years ago. We've got 4 nickel projects across Canada. And really what, some of the points that I think make us an interesting story is one, we've got some high quality assets. We've got 4 good quality nickel copper PG projects across Canada that range from sort of camp scale exploration projects to projects with resources that we're slowly advancing towards a development decision. Being in Sudbury is probably the most important part. And, for people that know nickel, know that it's not easy to find a nickel deposit. And being in Sudbury, which is arguably the best nickel camp in the world, certainly gives you a good head start. And for a junior company, that's pretty significant to have assets with resources in Sudbury. For once in my career, I feel like I'm actually in the good part of a cycle, and especially for nickel, the forecast over the next 5, 10, 15 years looks really positive for nickel, and a lot of that has to do with the nickel demand for EVs moving forward. Good strong team, good management team, proven track record of success from discovery and then taking those projects through discovery into the development stage. And really we're busy. We've got lots of stuff going on, so lots of catalysts for the investor over the year and into next year. So locations of our projects, we have one up in northern Canada called the Muscot project that I'll touch on today. The other 3 are located in the Sudbury area, 2 within Sudbury, and one just to the west of Sudbury. Sorry, east of Sudbury. So these are our 4 projects. Lockerbie East project and Air Kit are both in Sudbury. Lockerbie East is kind of our flagship project, and that's located next to the old past producing Lockerbie mine. And this is a project that we acquired in 2016. It hosts 3 deposits: the Lockerbie East deposit, which is an underground deposit; the Wes Graham deposit, which is a large surface deposit, lower grade but right at surface. And we've recently signed a deal with Vale where we have the option to acquire or to earn 100% in their Crean Hill 3 property, which is located right adjacent. And that's the other half of this Wes Graham deposit. And that's something pretty new for us, just happened this year. And it's, for people that work in Sudbury, know that Vale doesn't do deals very often in Sudbury. So that was quite an achievement for us. The Air Kid project is well positioned between two kind of world-class nickel assets in Sudbury, being the Totten mine and the Victoria project that's being developed. Muskox is one that I'm really excited about and really like. It's a a large camp scale opportunity located in northern Canada, in Nunavut. We have a huge land package. We've just recently consolidated the whole thing. So there's over 650 square kilometers ground that we have. And this is a project that's of a lot of interest and garnished a lot of interest from major mining companies, which are now looking for these big projects that they can get involved with. And a lot of you might be familiar with the Janes project. It's a Nipissing diabase hosted project just to the east of town. So I'm going to talk about Lockerbie East and the Muskox project. I guess only this works. So I don't need to explain the Sudbury Basin much to anyone, but our two projects being the Lockerbie East and the Air Kid project are located down in the southwest corner. And this is a pretty oh, is there a way to get that thing off the top? Does anyone know how to do that? We'll just have to deal with it. This is a pretty active corner of the basin. The most recent mine that was put in production is Totten mine, and that's down on the Worthington offset dike. Our Air Kid project is located next to that. And here's a picture of the KGHM head frame that's going up at Victoria right now, and they're beginning to develop that mine. So the Air Kid project is located between those two kind of quality assets. That's a picture of the old Lockerbie head frame, which is no longer there, but it was recently taken down. There's our Lockerbie East project. And for companies familiar with people familiar with Magna Mining, they're actively exploring on the Crean Hill property just adjacent to our Lockerbie East. So zooming into that area, on the left side, we have the Crean Hill mine, which was operated by Inco for a very long period of time. A very large mine, produced a lot of ore from underground, and that was recently acquired by Magna Mining. Next to that is the Lockerbie mine, which was operated by Falconbridge throughout the 70s into the around the mid 2000s or so, at which point it was sold to First Nickel, and First Nickel operated it until around 2015, at which point it ended up going into bankruptcy, and that's where we ended up by purchasing the adjacent properties out of a bankruptcy sale from First Nickel. So we ended up by buying this, what we call the Lockerbie East property, and that contains or hosts two deposits at the time. The Lockerbie East resource, which was mined from underground from Lockerbie, and that's a high grade deposit at depth. And then the Wes Graham deposit, which was a project that First Nickel did a lot of work on, put out a resource in 2009 on it. And it's a larger, lower grade resource that comes right close to surface. And this small little chunk of ground in here is called the Crean Hill 3 property, and that is a property that Vale had held. And as I mentioned, we signed an agreement with Vale, which allows us the ability to earn 100% of the surface rights and the mineral rights to that property. And we feel that represents at least the other half of this Wes Graham deposit, which is, combined has potential to be a fairly large open pittable resource. The next slide, that's just the geology, same image geology. Again, the deposits lie on close to the contact. I'll talk about Wes Graham and Crean Hill as being a little bit different, but just for the geology, the rocks on the green rocks are predominantly mafic volcanics. This kind of, I don't know what color it looks on there, kind of tan colored is the Creighton granite. And that, I think, is something that makes this deposit a little bit interesting. Most of these deposits occur at either the junction of the granites in the mafic volcanics or right on the volcanics. So Wes Graham and Crean Hill is a little bit different in that sense. That's a long section of the Lockerbie Crean Hill system. It's a little out of focus, but you can see the underground workings. These are just drill hole assays. Lockerbie had two underground, two shafts, and then a ramp where they were mining at depth. There was a underground ramp that went across to the small Lockerbie East high-grade deposit that was mined by Falconbridge and later by First Nickel. This over here is our property now, the combined Crean Hill and Wes Graham property. This is the large resource that's near surface that we've put together. The kind of lighter colored under the heads talking is the Wes Graham deposit, and adjacent to it, the blue, is what is the Crean Hill 3 deposit that we brought into the company through this agreement with Vale. Lockerbie East is situated down here, and these blue squares are geophysical conductors that extend down dip of Lockerbie that east, that allows us to believe that Lockerbie East is open at depth for almost an additional 1,000 meters. There's lots of, there's different styles of mineralization in this kind of area. You get these high grade, high tenor nickel sulfide deposits along the basal contact. And then you also see, which is what Wes Graham is comprised of, is these kind of broad zones of blebby, high tenor blebby sulfide that sit above the contact. And that is what this Wes Graham Crean Hill 3 system is like. Just some of the numbers. Lockerbie produced, just around 10 million tons. The Wes Graham resource that First Nickel did, or put out in 2009, is just under 11 million tons. That's non-compliant now, at a resource of around 0.55 nickel equivalent. So it's lower grade, but it's close to surface, and it's got really high nickel tenors. The Crean Hill 3 property that we've brought in through the agreement with Vale was last drilled in 1958 to the 60s, really wide spacings. And there was a historic estimate, eternal estimate of just under 17 million tons at similar grades. So there's potential for a really large deposit. And this is what we're actively working on right now. And just out of interest, that the shape of these two systems, mineralized systems, look very similar. At the end of last year, before we had the deal in place with Vale, we went out and did some work on the Wes Graham property. And just some of the characteristics is that it's this really thick zone, anywhere from 10 to 80 meters thick, of high tenor blebby sulfide, predominantly with a little bit of semi-massive to massive sulfide. It's quite extensive, and within that zone there is a higher grade core to that deposit. So this right here, just color wise, on the right is the inferred resources, on the left is the indicated, and the darker red is the higher grade mineralization. And what we started looking at, and what we noticed, is that the higher grade mineralization the grades seem to improve as you move towards the property boundary. And that was something that we wanted to test with this drill program that we did last year. So we did about 5,000 meters last year. Just a couple holes to highlight this. Hole number 1, which was drilled right on the property boundary, ended up with 24 meters of just under 1%. And actually some of that core is right here that you can look at, which is, almost double the grade of the historic resource. Hole 9, drilled a little bit deeper, had a thick zone of, almost 55 meters of 0.7, which is about 10 to 20% higher than the resource, but as well a thicker zone of up over 1%. So this was kind of the, what we thought was encouraging, that the grade seemed to improve at the property boundary. And, given where the property boundary is, it really prevented us from looking at this deposit from an open pit, because it's, leaving a boundary pillar, and with the pit walls, we weren't really able to do that. So that really pushed us to begin discussions with Vale. And after, a considerable amount of time, we were able to get a deal in place. And really what it came down to is we talked to, we sat down with their business development group, and both realized that we owned half of the deposit each. That was going to be challenging for either company to do anything with. But if we put those two properties and resources together, there was an opportunity for SPC to develop that asset and put something into production. So that was really the reason for doing that soil deal. It was kind of a win-win for both companies. So this is now a plan view of the combined Wes Graham Green Hill mineralized zone. Again, this is not a compliant resource. This is just a mineralized shell that we've put together. So on the Wes Graham side, the drill spacings is around 30 meters. On the Green Hill 3 side, it's 100 to 150 meters. So we've started drilling about a month and a half ago. I think we've got around 3,500 meters done already, and are moving at a pretty quick pace. Lots of short holes, lots of moves. Brad, who's the geologist in charge of the program here, can attest that there's no shortage of drill core coming in. It's every day to a day and a half, they've finished a hole and moving. You know, average holes are 100 to 200 meters depth. So we're moving through this really quick, and you know, we like what we see. Some of the best intersection we've had to date is right here that you can have a look at later. But it really shows that there's this large resource close to surface. In fact, it does outcrop on surface on the Ballet property. So just some of the things, what I want to do is just, you know, quickly kind of with pictures, just show some of the characteristics of this deposit. And really at the end, kind of summarize a little bit about why, you know, for people that are familiar with Sudbury, why this deposit seems to be quite different than things that I've at least looked at in Sudbury in the past. And probably number one is that the deposit is not hosted in sublayer or footwall breccias. It's not hosted at the contact. It's hosted in massive coarse grain south range norite. So that's what it looks like. It's pretty boring looking, medium to coarse grain, you know, a couple percent up to maybe 20% blue quartz, which is typical for this quartz range norite. And that's the host to the deposit, which is something that I hadn't seen before in Sudbury. You know, unlike sublayer where you see lots of mafic fragments, we don't see a lot of mafic fragments. We see a lot of granitic melts and granitic fragments throughout the norite sequence. And that's something that, again, I hadn't seen a lot of. There's some examples where you get these little melts of very felsic melts, and here you get some really distinct sort of angular or granitic fragments throughout. And this was within the mineralized zone as well. So this is just something that also relates to the fact that the deposit is sitting on granite instead of mafic volcanics. Probably what makes this project or makes it interesting is that the mineralization is really high, has a very high nickel tenor between about 5 and 8. So there's lots of pentlandite in it. It's a coarse grain blebby sulfide system with, interesting enough, next to no precious metals. So it's nickel, copper. There's a little bit of cobalt and some silver, but there is next to no platinum, palladium, or gold. You know, relative to Sudbury, extremely depleted in the precious metals. That's more or less what the mineralized zones look like. 5 to 10% blebby sulfide, maybe a little bit higher, but on average, I mean, that might be a little on the better side, but that's more or less what it looks like. And then, as I pointed out before, within that kind of thick zone of mineralization, there's actually a higher grade zone where you start to get closer to that 1%. And it's not a result of any sort of fractionation. It's just that there's more sulfides in it. And this is actually some of the polished core up here. That's what it looks like, although out of focus, but it's kind of this coarse blebby sulfide in this quartz-rich norite. And this material here is, you know, in pretty high grade for the amount of sulfides there, between 1% and 1.6% nickel. You can see that sort of material right here. And in the rare occasions, we get these minor zones of semi-massive to massive sulfides in, you know, something that you might consider sublayer, although it doesn't sit along the basal contact. And that's there's some of that mineralization is up here. This is an intersection we had this year where we had 7.86 meters. So from the two white lines, that ran about 2.5% nickel and 0.7. And if you look at the precious metals, it's 200 ppb. is all you're getting out of. I think the highest individual sample is probably a half a gram. So in general, in Sudbury, this is pretty low when it comes to precious metals. And we do see a little bit of sulfides in the footwalls. We haven't done a lot of drilling. Not a lot of the holes go deep into the footwall, but you do see some pyrrhotite stringers. It's tough to see because of the camera, but there is disseminated pyrrhotite and pentlandite and chalcopyrite throughout in the granite. So there is mineralization that is moving from the intrusion out into the footwall, but interesting enough that the mineralization doesn't sit at the contact. It's higher up. And that's the next point, is that the mineralization is anywhere between 20 and 100 meters above the contact of the Sudbury Basin. And that's something, at least for me, was quite unique that I'd never really seen before. This is just a section that tries to illustrate that. There's the contact, there's the mineralized zone, and in this case, there's probably 20 plus meters of barren norite, barren quartz-rich norite before you drill into a granite footwall. And a lot of times there's no sublayer. And in fact, most times there's no sublayer around that contact. It simply goes from unmineralized norite to mineralized norite to unmineralized norite again into the footwall. And that is, again, something that I haven't personally seen in Sudbury very often. So the controls on the mineralization, a lot of the big deposits on the South Range and even the North Range, I mean, they're controlled by these large embayments that commonly occur in either the mafic volcanics or right at the contact between the mafic, they call them tri-contacts, between the mafic volcanics and the granites. And if you went around the basin on the South Range, pretty much every deposit is like that. Crean Hill, Lockerbie, Creighton, moving around to Little Stobie and around, they're all hosted primarily on the mafic volcanics, where you develop these large embayments in the footwall, which collect this mineralization. At Wes Graham, that's not the case. We have this very broad, shallow embayment that sits on granite, and because it's granite, we just think that it didn't develop this big embayment. And although we don't have all the answers, we do think that this granite is the key to why this deposit may not be sitting on the footwall. It may have something to do with that. And then within these embayments, although they're not huge, there are some secondary controls on it where you get terraces within the embayment that we think control possibly where some of this higher grade mineralization is. And, and just some of the idea, that's the geology map of Sudbury. This would be the little embayment that hosts the Wes Graham deposit. This is part of the Crean Hill 3, but Wes Graham would be more or less here. And that broad primary trend is what controls the Wes Graham down to the Lockerbie East, and then the geophysical conductors would sit within this larger embayment. And then there's some secondary features on here that were probably structures that match up a little bit better with some of the regional structures that actually control what we think are terraces within this embayment that seem to control higher grade mineralization. So we've found that and you can just maybe make it out that even on the drill hole colors here, there's a lot more red right here and right here that line up with these secondary features. And these actually also line up with the surface outcrops of mineralization. And also it's in the, at Sudbury, Lockerbie and Wes Graham, like at other places in the South Range, regional folding plays a role in the distribution of mineralization. And there we go. So that on the left side is just a section through the Wes Graham at the top and Lockerbie East in the middle. And you can see how the contact starts off dipping to the north, and then it actually overturns, goes back to the south. And there's a couple more folds in it. And it's within those fold noses where we seem to get the higher grade mineralization associated with something like Lockerbie East. Wes Graham seems to be on the limb of that. And Wes Graham and Lockerbie East seem to have this relationship where it almost looks as if you've taken this 10 to 80 meter wide zone at Wes Graham, and as you move down dip, it starts to get compacted and turn into a 5 to 10 meter wide zone at Lockerbie East of massive sulfide. It's got very similar tenors, very similar grades. I don't know how that happens, but it's certainly what it looks like. And if you move over to Lockerbie, the Lockerbie system on the right side, up at surface, you had the Ellen pit that was operated by Vale, and it has this hanging wall mineralization, much like the Wes Graham system. And we just feel that Ellen pit is probably the down dip edge of equivalent of the Wes Graham deposit, and the rest of it would have been higher up. But you get to the first fold nose, and that's kind of the beefiest part of the Lockerbie East deposit. As you come down the first fold, there's kind of a bit of a thinning and a dead zone. And then again, at the next fold nose, you get higher grade mineralization. So that's obviously a secondary process, but it does seem to play an important role in concentrating mineralization. And whether it becomes structurally remobilized or whatever it might be, those fold noses do seem to be important. So just to kind of summarize a little bit about what we think, again, I haven't seen everything in Sudbury, so based on my experience, what I think looks different between Wes Graham and other deposits on the South Range, and what makes it kind of unique in our opinion, is number one, the footwall. It is granite. There's no mafic volcanics. It is 100% granite footwall, which if you go home and look at your geology map, you're hard pressed to find any deposits on the South Range that are hosted entirely on the granites. Traditionally, it's on the mafic volcanics or those contacts between the mafic volcanics and the granites. The host rock, and this is probably the most unique thing, is that it's quartz-rich norite. There's, the occasional zone of sublayer and footwall breccia, but 95% or more of the mineralization sits in pretty boring, medium to coarse grain, quartz-rich norite. Whereas most of the other top deposits I'd ever looked at, you may have mineralization in the norite, but that seems to increase as you go down stratigraphy, and with the bulk of the mineralization either being in the sublayer or in the immediate footwall in footwall breccias. And that kind of is the next point, is this idea that sulfides kind of rain down through the SIC as it's cooling. Most of the other deposits give you some evidence that you can see this increase in nickel as you move down through stratigraphy, with the bulk of it sitting along the contact. At Wes Graham, we don't see that. There's no sharp horizon where all the mineralization stops. It's almost as if you're looking at like a sill that's transporting sulfides, and it has this kind of D-shaped profile for mineralization where the mineralization increases, it peaks, and then it starts to drop off, and then commonly you'll go into barren norite. And that just, to me, doesn't scream of something that is settling from above down. So it's different, I think. Metal tenors are also different, in my opinion. This is really high grade. The average tenor is over 6. It gets up to 8, and probably as low as about 5. Copper is probably on an average similar to other. So this is averaged over here on compared to other South Range deposits from Peter Lightfoot's book. So it's within the range of other nickel deposits. Precious metal wise, it's certainly low, very low. Like a nickel tenor of under 2 grams for massive sulfide is pretty low for Sudbury. So whether or not that means the PGs have actually been lost someplace, and should you be looking in the footwall, should you be looking to another part of the deposit, that's a question that we're working on and at this point don't have an answer for. But it's certainly something that's unique to this deposit. I mean, as you move to the west and you go to Lockerbie's higher grade, higher PG concentrations, and then if you move over to the Crean Hill deposit that Magna Mining's working on, that's got a lot of precious metals. So the PG content seems to increase as you move to the west in those three deposits. And I would say the nickel tenor seems to increase to the east, with the Wes Graham Lockerbie East system being the highest. And then the location of the mineralized zone in the characteristics of the mineralized zone being that it sits above the basal contact is not something I mean, there's examples throughout different deposits where you can have kind of massive sulfide a little bit higher up, but the bulk of those deposits still usually occur on the contacts. And in this case, it is, it's almost floating in the norites, which is a little bit strange and something that you have to kind of figure out how that would actually happen. And that it is a blebby sulfide system. There's not a lot of massive sulfide. We hope there's more, but so far the bulk of it has been a blebby sulfide system. I mean, I think back to my experience drilling with Falconbridge and throughout the north and south range, and usually you'd see blebby sulfide in the norites, but then that would progressively increase into the sublayer. But the grade in the norites was always pretty low. But in fact, we rarely ever sampled it because you were always looking for this massive sulfide along the contact. So the last point there is, I mean, there might be a lot more examples of these sorts of deposits in Sudbury, but I think traditionally they probably wouldn't have been looked at this style of mineralization for blebby sulfide in the norites above the contact. Probably would have been passed over, maybe sampled. You can even tell from some of the the historic drilling that Vale Inco did on this property is that they were looking for massive sulfides, and they sampled the norites, but sometimes they didn't sample all of it because you can tell it's not massive sulfide, but it's got really high tenors, so it does produce some pretty decent grades still. So that's the a bit on Sudbury and the Wes Graham deposit. Now I'll get into more of just a visual, kind of some slides of Muskox project, which I've got the privilege to go up there a couple times last year. And for anyone who's ever got the chance to work up in Nunavut, it's a spectacular place. And this area, the people, the terrain, the geology is something I've never quite seen before, and it's an amazing location. This is the Coronation Gulf, just in this image. The river here is the Coppermine River, and that's the community. You can kind of make it out. It's a little blurry, but that's the community of Kaglugtuk on the coast, which is where we based our operations out of when we were working up there. So regional sort of geology, the Muskox intrusion is this purple unit that you see here. It looks like a big funnel, and it's about 120 kilometers in strike length. The pink colored rocks are part of the Wapme orogeny. So this is right on the edge of the Slave province. So those are mainly granitic rocks and lots of sediments as well. The yellow line that you see there is a regional unconformity between the older Wapme rocks and the overlying sediments. So these are the Dismal Lake group. These would be shallow marine carbonate sediments. And so the Muskox intrusion wasn't placed right at this unconformity. And then sitting above that in the green are the Coppermine River flood basalts that are extensive flood basalt province associated with the Mackenzie Large Igneous Province, which is one of the largest igneous provinces on the planet, which with the flood basalts have thicknesses up to almost 5 kilometers. So this is a major magmatic event tied into the mantle plume, which is thought to be almost a couple hundred kilometers further north. And that would be, the part that's associated with the Mackenzie dike swarm that even makes its way all the way down to Ontario. So this is it. And then further up, the kind of lighter green are more sediments. And then you have what are called the Franklin or the Coronation sills, so large sill complex. So this is a massive igneous event, huge plumbing system. It's got lots of, the geological environment has been compared to that of Norilsk a lot. You've got a major structural zone, which is basically being the edge of a craton, being the edge of the Slave Province. You've got the relationship between these massive flood basalt province. So you've got the intrusion that represents the feeder plumbing system, or thought to represent the plumbing system, to these big, extensive flood basalts. And then, on the digging in a little deeper, the intrusion is mineralized, like Norilsk and also the mid-continental rift. There's evidence to suggest that some of the flood basalts are depleted in nickel, and those units correlate to the mineralized units in the muskox intrusion. So geology-wise, it's got a lot of the check marks you want to be looking for a big mineralized system. Originally, we had about 47,000 hectares of ground that we acquired through staking. And then just earlier this year, well, you can't really barely read that. Can you focus it a bit or see if you can? Earlier this year, we signed an option agreement. Yeah, that's better. An option agreement with a company called Bathurst Metals to consolidate the rest of the camp. So we now control the entire stakeable portion of the muskox intrusion. So we added these two areas in red here, one being the Spears Lake property and the McGregor Lake property. So now we have over 65,000 hectares, so 650 square kilometers. And the properties that we brought in historically have the best grab samples and drill hole intersections. And those are some of the historic drill hole intersections dating back to Inco in the late 50s. But what's encouraging is that there is the grades of mineralization that you need in order to make something economic up in this location. So example, the one hole 8705, 13 and almost 14 meters of 5% copper, 2.5 or 2.2 nickel, very high precious metals content, so up and over an ounce sort of material. So this is an extremely high grade system. It's huge. There's been some good indications of mineralization at surface and in drill core. And really the last time it was looked at systematically was probably 2005. So for almost 20 years, it's sat dormant, and lots have changed in that time. The understanding about nickel systems, I think in particularly the understanding about where to look within the plumbing system of these big intrusions, and also geophysical techniques. The last group, and I'll show you the last group that was in here, started to do some ground controlled source MT that really started, in my opinion, to highlight some of the opportunities that might exist here. So it was discovered in the 50s by Inco, and they were doing reconnaissance flights, by fixed wing reconnaissance flights over the Arctic, and they saw these massive zones, massive Gossens zones on surface, and that's what got them into this area. I'll show you some pictures of it. They're truly spectacular. And they did a lot of work over a 2 or 3 year period, and then they ended up by making, that was about the same time they made the major discovery in Thompson, and basically shifted gears and went to Thompson, and this property, they kind of walked away from that. It's changed hands every 10 years. Someone seems to take a shot at it again. And, but it hasn't been looked at in probably 20 years. It's one of the largest layered mafic, ultramafic intrusions in the world, relatively undeformed. It's interesting because it's got a very shallow dip of about 3 to 5 degrees to the north. The entire kind of sequence of the intrusion is exposed. So you have a 60-kilometer long feeder dike in the south, or that's what it's interpreted to be, is a feeder dike. So that's exposed for 60 kilometers north. And then that the main intrusion is also 60 kilometers long. And so the thought is that this feeder dike actually extends all the way underneath the middle part of this intrusion. And the idea is that this intrusion itself may actually continue for another 200 kilometers further to the north, based on mag and gravity, to where the Mackenzie plume head is thought to be. Big intrusion, almost 11 kilometers wide at its maximum, 120, 130 kilometers long. And we control almost all of that right now. There's kind of four main geological areas, components. There's what's called the feeder dike in the south, and the feeder dike, as I mentioned, is interpreted to extend underneath the entire intrusion. There's the marginal zone, so that would be this kind of orange colored rock along the edge, and that's the host of most of the mineralization. And that's also, so that occurs on the edge of the intrusion, but also in the feeder dike. And that's the rock that is geochemically similar to the flood basalt units that are interpreted to show metal depletion. And then in the middle, you have this really thick layered series of, up to a couple kilometers of prototites, peroxenites, dunites, kind of beautiful rock textures, the stuff you used to see in your igneous petrology class. And then right up at the top, you have what's called the roof zone, and that's basically thought to be, as the name says, the top of the intrusion where it interacted with the overlying sediments. And then in addition to that, so there's lots of different mineralized environments that make this intrusion, really quite interesting. There is stratiform reefs, so much like the bushveld, higher up in the sequence, and that's what these little black dashed lines are. And I'll show you a little bit more about that. There's basal kind of contact style mineralization, so much like you'd see in Sudbury, mineralization along the contact, and that's probably what drew most people into this area. There's what they called the Keel Zone, and that basically just represents the area where the feeder dike meets up with the main intrusion, and is thought to be where the plumbing system starts to bring magma into this main intrusion. And then there's the feeder dike to the south. And a lot of these areas, when I looked at them, show lots of similarities to other nickel deposits around the world. That's cross-section through it, showing these different environments. So over top, you've got the Dismal Lake and the Hornby Bay group. The top is like the flood basalts. You've got these shallow marine sediments that are younger, sitting in the kind of purple and orange. Then you've got an unconformity where the muskox intrusion comes in. So the granophyre, the roof rocks are in red, and they'll actually show big enclaves of the overlying sediments. Then you've got the layered series, and then this marginal series that then starts to move down into the feeder dike. And then you have the basement rocks on either side. And all these country rock lithologies are sulfide bearing. There's lots of sulfides in the country rock. So your mineralized environments are these reef horizons. So these are chromite reef zones that are higher up in the stratigraphy, and there's a number of them. So that's very similar to things like the bushveld in the Stillwater. Basal contact and footwall mineralization. So this is where mineralization occurs in what looks like little embayments in the contact, and a lot of times is also fractionated into more copper-rich material out into the footwall. And so that kind of echoes of things like Sudbury and even parts of Voisey's Bay and Norilsk. This Keel Zone, which is kind of where the last bit of work was being done. And that's also about the time that Voisey's Bay was going into production and being advanced, that people started to understand this idea of where you have this plumbing system coming up into a bigger intrusion, much like the ovoid. That's a really interesting spot to look. And that's what this Keel Zone is. And that extends all the way underneath the intrusion. And then the feeder dike, which extends underneath the intrusion, has lots of similarities to, I think, offset dikes. And also, if you think about the Voisey's Bay plumbing system, things like the Reed Brook zone, so where you're getting changes in the shape of this dike is where mineralization seems to occur. So just kind of generally looking at all the different areas, this is this stratiform reef horizon. So it occurs right at this lithological contact between these two units. It's a skinny little thing, just like the bushveld and the Morensky reef are. You get these little chromite seams, only a couple centimeters thick, but they're really extensive. And these are just some of the historic grab samples that were along this. In this property, you always got to remember the scale. That's over about 10 kilometers. So you're getting up to 6+ grams of platinum and palladium in these chromite reefs that shallowly dip to the west. So it's a huge area. I mean, there's right there alone in one reef, is probably over 100 square kilometers of potential target. That's really been poked at with a couple holes, and all these holes hit these chromite seams. Basal contact and footwall mineralization. This is what got Inco interested in this area. These just extensive Gossens that go on for 30, 40 kilometers in strike length. They're, until I flew over them in a helicopter, I didn't really know what to expect, but it's truly quite spectacular how extensive they are. And that's where most of the work has been done. To date, no one's really found a big zone of mineralization. There's been a lot of kind of discontinuous pods of mineralization, but really high grade. And there's a couple examples of a few Inco holes. And this would be the contact right here with the intrusion being to the left side. So these would be over here would be sulfide rich sediments. And a lot of the mineralization occurs either at the contact or in footwall as massive sulfide veins. And some of these veins show fractionation like you'd expect to see in a fractionated sulfide system. Not as much on this Keel Zone, but this to me is the most interesting part. This would be just down in the very south part of the main intrusion where the feeder dike runs into or comes into place with the main intrusion. And this is a pretty dynamic environment where you're getting magma being fed into this big chamber. There's some examples of these, I think they call them football breccias or something that occur right within this Keel Zone. There's a big breccia bodies, which is suggesting that you're getting a lot of magma coming into these intrusions. This would be similar to something like maybe Voisey's Bay and the Ovoid. And this was just some of the very last work that was done by a company called Silvermet, where they started to do MT across the intrusion, looking for where the feeder dike comes into the main intrusion. And these were, if you look at depth, this is almost down 1,000 meters. It's mapping out the edges of the intrusion. You have big bodies of serpentinized ultramafics that are really tough for most geophysical systems to get through. But this map, and there's a whole series of sections that they did, they're starting to show what I think is the feeder dike coming into the intrusion, and it represents a chargeability anomaly associated with it. And that's really never been tested on this property and on this intrusion. I think that's probably one of the more interesting targets to look at. The feeder dike itself to the south, this is just one little example. I think on the right are PGE values and on the left are nickel values. This dike is 200 to 600 meters wide. It's layered with gabbronorites to peritites to ultramafic mafic rocks. These mineralized rocks are the same rocks that occur on the edge of the intrusion, so they're all mineralized. And what we found when we were out there is we found disseminated sulfide that had high grade blebby sulfide, massive sulfide, and where, like in Sudbury in the offset dikes, where you get some bends and twists and turns in the feeder dike, that seems to be the areas where mineralization occur. So that 60 kilometer long feeder dike has never been drill tested, has never had a modern ground geophysics on it, and really hasn't even had any airborne geophysics. So there's lots of opportunities for sure. So I was just going to show some pictures now. We looked at this one. This is the hamlet of Kuglugtuk, and it sits on one of these Franklin sills. So the community is built on top of a big sill. This is the Coppermine River. That's the Coronation Gulf. There's one of these big Franklin sills. So if you can think about driving around the Thunder Bay area and you strip away all the trees, that's what these things look like. This is the Coppermine River flood basalts. So there's literally tens of kilometers of flood basalts that you fly over. This is a really interesting photo. This is the muskox intrusion looking to the north. So these would be the contacts of the intrusion. So you have the on this side, you get more granitic rocks, and on the other side, you can kind of tell by the layering, there's more sediments over here, but all sulfide bearing. And this is essentially the muskox intrusion right here. This is probably about 3 kilometers across, down at this end, just because of the perspective that we're at. This is about 11 kilometers down here. And you can just make out that there's Gossens developed along here in both contacts. It dips in at about 30 degrees, and then you have the funnel and the feeder dike going down beneath. So this dashed line is the central access where they think that the feeder dike exists below. This is a picture of the old, so this would have been from this McGregor Lake up here. This was the old 1950s Inco Camp, which is still there. This wasn't from when I went up there because there's actually a drill turning. It looks a lot worse than this photo does, but they've kept reusing the same camp over almost 50 years. And it's been a bit of an eyesore now, but that's the camp that was set up by Inco back in the 50s. There's the Gossens that you see at surface. So that's over a couple kilometers, and that's what drew everyone into this area. And you walk around there and, it's pretty rotten stuff, but everywhere you look is massive sulfide. A lot of it is kind of pods and boulders within the country rock, but that would be the edge of the intrusion. And, it's quite spectacular. You see that it goes on for tens of kilometers. That's looking the other direction now to the south. And this is where the muskox starts to narrow down. And off in the distance would be where the feeder dike extends out from that. So this kind of interface between this, the feeder dike and the intrusion would be what would be called the keel. And that extends underneath. And this would probably be a couple kilometers in width right here. That's a picture of the Coppermine River, which is a pretty spectacular river to fly over. This is down into the south. It's nothing special, but that's basically what south. It's a lot higher elevation as you move to the south, and you start to get different vegetation, different outcrop exposure. So this is the feeder dike. Essentially, these ridges of rocks all represent the feeder dike that you walk on. That's a couple 100 meters wide. It's really tough to see much because the rocks have this really weird black lichen that grows all over them. As you move a little bit further south, you get some trees. That's about the extent of the vegetation that you see. In the feeder dike, it's tough to see much, but in the odd case where you find a tree blown over, you'll start to see some evidence of, magma mixing and brecciation forming. In here you can start to see some sedimentary fragments in there. So that's all good signs that there's it's a dynamic environment. That's sort of what some of the sulfide occurrences look like, just these rusty Gossens that go on for hundreds of meters. You'll see some nice sulfide blebs. And if you've ever been to Nunavut, to the one thing, that's our field assistant Chris, that there's lots of bugs up there. It's actually quite spectacular how many mosquitoes. And I always like this picture because they look like a bunch of little bombers coming in to attack us. But yeah, the worst bugs I've ever experienced in my entire life, for sure. And I think that concludes it. Yep. Don't know if there's any questions.
So what's your plan for the summer? What goal projects?
So for Wes Graham, we're drilling right now. So we'll be drilling for the year and looking to our goal is to have an updated resource by the end of the year. So one drill turning right now, probably ramp up to 2. The muskox is, I suspect, will be up there again for a short program. We're kind of weighing our options on that right now. I think my personal feeling is we'd like to find a strategic partner to come in and help us advance that, because it's such a big project, and it's not cheap to work up there. I think the upside is huge, but you need some deep pockets. That's the hope. Yep. Yep. Yeah. that's in place. So our side, the Wes Graham side of that deposit is done. Like, I mean, it was drilled by First Nickel. It's just, it's not compliant at this point. On the Crean Hill 3 side that we brought in, the drill spacing is just too wide, 150. So we've got to basically drill holes in between. And that's what Brad's working on right now. So once we get those holes, we've got about 25,000 meters planned for this year. I think we've probably drilled 3 already, 3,500 already. So the hope is we get all that work done by the end of short holes. It's going really quick. The lab turnaround time is a lot better than it was. I think we're only a couple weeks per hole. So it's coming fast and furious, and then get all that data to the lab, to the group that's doing the resource, and hopefully that's towards the end of the year. And it's a pretty simple deposit, so there's not a lot of complex structure to deal with. It's just a pretty big boring sheet.
And you mentioned it's 100 meters off football.
Well, up to it, it's up to 100, 10 meters to, yeah.
And I remember, and it's been a long time since I looked at 10. It's also
yeah.
contact.
Yeah.
Of course, also was to the Gossens.
Yeah.
Again, I thought that had on the hanging wall side, like it had a basal mineralization, but then and it was a very small pit towards the middle of the pit. So again, it's a little bit offset.
I wouldn't be surprised that there's a lot more of it all the way along that granite. I've looked at some stuff from what's it called? The Creighton, I think it's the 402 zone Creighton. Yes, and at least some of the pictures I've seen show very similar sorts of kind of coarse grained bloody sulfide in the hanging wall. I would say at Lockerbie, at least some of the reports of the Ellen pit that was mined by Inco suggest that there was a hanging wall zone as well. And I think at the time, nickel prices were different. The target was massive sulfide, and it probably didn't get looked at.
And we've been thinking, just a conversation years ago, of negative dynamics almost died period. Got back along.
Yeah, that's where we're kind of at in our thinking.
Yeah.
And I don't have concrete facts to back any of this up, but the fact that we see this mineralized zone that's usually followed by a boring dead zone of norite underneath it, and that zone can be 10 meters to 100 meters, and sometimes it even occurs in the middle, is we think that maybe there's been some readjustment of the crater on the south range that's basically caused norite to shift around. And in our case, maybe it actually comes, almost like a slurry along the contact, and essentially lifts up this previously mineralized zone and moves it higher up in the sequence. And that may also explain why we don't see any sublayer, is that it's actually been moved away. And some of this massive sulfide that we're seeing may actually have been sublayer hosted mineralization that's now been transported a little higher up. Yeah.
Because as you see the vast majority of deposits, you notice the areas radiating down, but in the little zones and you look at, there's no obvious set, and there's no those uneven distribution, which makes you think there's a different process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and those are the things that we look at and go, this looks a little different. It doesn't look like your traditional deposit. Again, we can't explore off our property, but I bet if you moved east towards Creighton and even the Copper Cliff, you'd probably find more of it. Oh, there's a question here. Yep. Okay, that's it.